All right, guys, time to start talking about some Deutscher here. So I have here highlighted the thesis that Best kind of talks about not only how he feels about Worf, but his own opinion. So if different languages influence our minds in different ways, this is not because of what our language allows us to think, but rather because of what it habitually obliges us to think about. So to break that down, we want to make sure we understand what habitual and obliges means. So when we see habitual, and see the word habit there. So I know that a habit is something that is done over and over and over again, almost like a pattern. And I know that a habit is something that I almost do subconsciously, like click my pen or tap my foot or scroll through my phone when I'm bored. So I know that it is something that's over and over again and it doesn't require a lot of thought. So then obliges, I see it makes me think of obligate, obligation, which means something that I have to do, something that's I'm made to do. So if I reread the sentence, if different languages influence our minds in different ways, this is not because of what our language allows us to think, but rather because of what it, without thinking, continually makes us think about. So without really having to think about it, it makes us think about it all the time. Okay? So as I was going through your work for the last few weeks, I have noticed where we're seeming to get confused is kind of the order of which this happens. So we're getting confused of like how far we go. So I have this little graph here. So the first step is always that language is created, right? That throughout history, a language is created by a group of people. And those languages are very different. They have different grammatical rules, they have different words that are being used, but this isn't what is stopping us or having us unable to understand something. And you can learn any language, right? You could learn a language that has a different grammatical idea than you guys are, right? In Spanish or in French, you have gender, different grammatical structures. So it doesn't matter what the language is or how it's spoken or anything like that, you guys can learn it, right? You learn a language in high school because it's required. It's an awesome thing. So the first step is that language is created. So let's say we're talking about Spanish, okay? And that language uses gender. Now that's just a rule of the language. Now, who's to say a million years ago, well, not a million, but thousands of years ago when Spanish was created, if they chose those genders for a reason or if they were randomly assigned, okay? So it is not that the fact that it uses gender where we're getting our habit of mind, right? This is just how the language works. That brings us to people are required to think about gender constantly. So I have to think about the gender of the table in order to grammatically talk about the table. I have to talk about the chair. I have to talk about the fork. I have to talk about the bridge in order to talk about it in a correct grammatical form. Now, again, if we're talking about this, the language uses gender, it's not because bridges are inherently feminine, because then every language that uses gender would have a feminine bridge, but that's not true. Right, we see that in the article. We have different people talking about different things. So, therefore, it's not that we have a reason to do it, it's that it's grammatically correct. The language is asking us to think about it. Okay? And that leads to the habit of mind. Okay? So what is it that people who are required to think about gender constantly, what is the habit of mind that becomes here? So in the article, it talks about how, for instance, people would prefer an inanimate object to have a male or female voice depending on the article that they use, their gendered article, like L or law. Okay? So that would mean that the habit of mind is that people think of inanimate, non-gendered items as being more masculine or feminine depending on what it is their grammatically correct idea is, right? Because we see this change between, I believe it's German and Spanish, that one is masculine, one is feminine, and it has nothing to do with the fact that a bridge is masculine or feminine, right? They're not really a boy or a girl, right? But it's that grammatically correct use of gender over and over and over again throughout your entire life that you begin to see these things, okay? Which is why, if you are someone who's studying Spanish or any of those, you haven't thought about it maybe your entire life, right? You haven't been brought up your entire life to think about it, so you may not have this habit of mind. You don't have this pattern going on in your head, whereas someone who does would just inherently sort of think about this, do it without thinking. I don't know about you guys, but when I took Spanish in high school, I was constantly having to think about or memorize the gender pronouns of like what things were. And so it's not something it's not a habit, right? It's not something that I'm constantly without thinking about doing. It's something that I had to think about because I hadn't been talking about it that way my entire life. In fact, I'd been talking about it a very different way. That doesn't mean I can't understand that la mesa is table or el tenedor is fork, right? And nowhere there do I somehow think that someone who speaks Spanish can't tell a dude from a fork. But it's because they use it all the time correctly that by the time they become an adult or, you use words constantly throughout your life, you've thought about it kind of subconsciously your whole life, creating this habit of mind. Okay? So that's what I mean when there's two parts to this thesis. It's not just about what we habitually obliged or what we're habitually obliged to think about, which would, in this case, would have been gender, but it's also then, once we're doing this, how does it influence our mind? Okay, and that's where we get that habit of mind or that thinking process. Okay? I hope this kind of helped you with some of Deutscher's arguments. If you have any other questions, please let me know.